Welcome to the OWASP API Top 10 API Security. Stories from real-world data breaches. I'm here with Eli.
Hello.
And today we are going to talk about the OWASP API Top 10. The people who don't know, OWASP API Top 10 is a subset of the OWASP Foundation organization, which is a non-profit organization that collects the top 10 security risks in different aspects around the world. The API Security Top 10 is a dedicated list of 10 most critical API security risks that the industry as a whole gathered to identify and find and list all the top 10 security risks to help you understand and mitigate and prevent security risks from happening in your organization. It's really important to know that the OWASP API Top 10 is different from the OWASP Web App Security Top 10. While some of the things that you will hear sound familiar and similar, but the whole purpose and the list is different. So join me in the journey to learn more about the OWASP API Top 10. And without further ado, Eli, the stage is yours.
Thanks, Menachem. So here is the 2023 list of the OWASP API Top 10 security risks. We will review each one, explain the security risk, provide examples, countermeasures, and review real-world stories from the media or detected by the Akamai API security platform. As you would see, these API-related data breach stories cross industry boundaries. Airlines, financial services, telecommunications, education, and automotive are a few examples we will share with you. So the first and most common API security risk is BOLA, or Broken Object Level Authorization. To put it in simple terms, a user is able to manipulate parameters like user ID or account ID in the API request in order to gain access to another user's data. BOLA is hard to detect by traditional security controls such as Web Application Firewall or API Gateway, as the request itself seems legitimate, but it exploits a flaw in the business logic, which is up to the API developers to recognize and enforce. In this diagram, we see user A, which has rightful access to his data, user A data. This is what's called a one-to-one mapping. One user can access one data record. A violation of this relationship is what BOLA is all about. With insufficient authorization check, user A might be able to access user B or C or N data, which makes it one-to-many mapping. Once the flaw is discovered, attackers automate the process and grab millions of user records for fraudulent activities. Coinbase is a crypto trading platform, and a security researcher discovered a vulnerability that effectively allowed them to sell crypto that they did not own. For this, the researcher was rewarded with the largest bug bounty that Coinbase ever paid, $250,000. What you see here on the bottom left in the tweet is in which the researcher announces that they just sold Bitcoin, a pair he does not have access to and does not hold. What he did was look at the traffic between the web interface and the backend. He basically reverse engineered or sniffed the traffic between the application and the backend and identified the API calls. He identified 4 parameters in that call, which I'll show you in the next screen. He was able to manipulate those parameters to trade crypto on an account that did not belong to him. Here is what he was able to see in the traffic. You'll see here in the yellow box the 4 items, the 4 elements of a transaction. So there was the product ID, which is what he was trading. the order, in this case a sell order, the source account, and the target account. He effectively overrode the source account to be an account that did not belong to him. This is not something you could do on the web interface, but in an API call, you can construct any type of request that you'd like. He simply changed the source account from user A to user B. And down below is the confirmation of the successful transaction. At this point, he knew he had found a very significant flaw. He contacted the company, and the company did a very fine job of reacting. The first thing they did was to shut down the service, recreate the issue, and then issue a fix. By the next day, the site was back up. They also blogged about it. The cause of this bug was a missing logic validation check in Coinbase brokerage application. The app was not confirming that the user submitting the transaction owned the accounts related to the transaction. This is a classic BOLA, or broken object level authorization flaw, where user A is able to act on behalf of user B. When this researcher tried the same request the following day, he got an error. And as you can see here, source account does not match product ID. They were able to insert the logic into the application to prevent that type of activity from happening again. But until it had been discovered, that was a vulnerability waiting to be exploited. API 2 is broken authentication. This API security risk can manifest in various ways. Weak authentication mechanisms such as 4-digit PIN code that can be easily guessed, one-factor authentication mechanism using public information of users, or even, in some cases, no authentication at all. Broken authentication can lead to mass data breaches and large-scale frauds, as we'll see in the following story. Let's start from the end. A Melbourne family lost $40,000 from an identity theft sourced by an API-related data breach. The leaked data, which included passports and driver license details, was later used for identity theft like this one in the article. The imposter used the family's stolen identity details to apply for loans and credit cards with overall monetary damage of tens of thousands of dollars. How did this happen? In 2022, Optus, Australia's second largest telecom company, suffered a massive data breach of 11.2 million sensitive customer records. The hacker published 2 samples of the stolen data on a well-known data leak forum. The ransom amount that he demanded was $1 million in cryptocurrency. This large-scale data breach involved stolen details of passports, driver licenses, government-issued medical identity cards. The breach resulted also in class action suit. So how did this happen? An API from an Optus customer identity database was open to a test network that had internet access with no authentication. The hacker enumerated through the contact ID parameter to extract their entire customer database. Although the massive data coming out of this API endpoint should have raised an alert, the hacker was able to export millions of customer records. So API 3 is broken object property level authorization, or BOPLA. Simply put, APIs often rely on web or mobile application to present only the required information to the end user. APIs are oversharing information, including PII or sensitive data, and malicious actors take advantage of this weakness. In the next story, we will review how a seemingly harmless Instagram post led to exposing sensitive information of a public figure. Using Australia's former Prime Minister Tony Abbott's Instagram post with his flight boarding pass, the hacker was able to leverage the flight booking reference code and Tony Abbott's last name to get excessive sensitive information, such as his passport number, expiration date, and even phone number. The Qantas passenger details page webpage showed only his name and flight details, but the underlying APIs responded with the PII or sensitive data, the passport number, the expiration date, and the phone number. This is a classic example of excessive data exposure or BOPLA. API 4 is unrestricted resource consumption, which means the resource behind the API endpoint can be repeatedly accessed with no limitation. This can lead to brute force attacks, denial of service attacks, and it's the next step in the attacker kill chain once a vulnerability is found and validated, to repeatedly and programmatically exploit it over and over again in order to scale up the data breach to millions of impacted users. In this case, late 2023, a hacker offered to sell 2.6 million records of language teaching platform Duolingo, including email addresses, usernames, names, and phone numbers, information about social networks, and other generic info such as language studies, experience, progress, achievements, etc. The hacker discovered a bug or a business logic flaw in one of Duolingo's API endpoints, in which by sending a valid email, the API returns all information about that user, including PII information. In API security-related data breaches, once a vulnerability is found and confirmed in sporadic events, the attackers automate the data scraping process and programmatically scale up the data breach to millions of records. This large-scale data exfiltration should not be possible without unrestricted resource consumption. API gateways or web application firewalls should detect large numbers of requests coming from a handful of clients and block their access to prevent such large-scale data breaches. API 5 is broken function-level authorization, case where a user can perform unauthorized functions in the application. Examples can be obtaining admin-only functions or premium member functions by manipulating a parameter in the request body, URL, or header. Other functions may be related to the HTTP method type. For example, delete method to remove a user record instead of a get or a post method. In this story, covered in details by Sam Curry, a group of ethical hackers found a variety of vulnerabilities in car manufacturers' mobile apps. It turned out that the same company, SiriusXM, was providing telematic services to these 6 automotive brands. The bottom line is that using the car VIN number, which is simply printed on every car's windshield, the hackers were able to remote control the cars. The hackers found a token exchange API endpoint, passed the VIN number in the body of the request, and received a valid token. With this token, they were able to perform multiple unauthorized functions, like turning on the lights and horn, as seen in the screenshot below. This was a result of a combination of OWASP API top 10 vulnerabilities, such as broken function-level authorization, but also broken authentication and BOPLA. API 6 is unrestricted access to sensitive business flows. This is another technique attackers leverage when scaling up a vulnerability they successfully exploited in small scale. A few examples can be purchasing concert tickets with unauthorized discounts, or creating large number of new user accounts to enjoy a sign-up bonus multiple times. In this example, detected by the Akamai API security platform, a single user sent over 27,000 post requests to an API endpoint with a single body parameter change with each request. The majority of the requests, around 98% of them, were successful, and the user was able to download 26 megabytes of data. This is not restriction on there is no restriction on the number of requests coming from a single user by the API gateway, web application firewall, or application server. The user can scrape as much data as possible each time by modifying a single body parameter. API 7 is SSRF, or server-side request forgery. In this API security risk, an attacker is able to gain access to a company resource by manipulating a URL query parameter containing the remote resource. Since the remote resource is passed as a query parameter, often it's being passed through the API gateway and web application firewall, reaches the application server that executes the command in the query parameter. In the following story, you'll see how this vulnerability was exploited to gain access to remote AWS S3 buckets containing millions of sensitive customer records. On July 2019, Capital One announced they found an authorized access by an outside individual who obtained certain types of personal information relating to people who had applied to its credit card products. This event affected approximately 100 million individuals in the United States and approximately 6 million in Canada. The hacker gained access to data included approximately 140,000 social security numbers, approximately 80,000 bank account numbers on US consumers, and roughly 1 million social insurance numbers, SINs, for Canadian credit card customers. The attacker gained access to a set of AWS access keys by leveraging SSRF to AWS EC2 metadata service. These keys essentially allow the attacker to list and sync the S3 bucket to a local disk, providing access to all data contained in them. Here is a typical SSRF attacker flow. First, they try to embed remote resource, the URL, into a query parameter, header, or body parameter to check if localhost is accessible. Then they perform port scanning to find a responsive port sharing various API endpoints. Third, leveraging one of those found endpoints, such as the /users endpoint, the attacker gains access to various user roles, like admin. In the last step, attackers try to gain access to the AWS metadata endpoint to capture credentials to AWS resources, such as S3 buckets with sensitive information. And this is how it looks like on the Akamai API security platform. The attacker included a URL-encoded local resource in an HTTP request header on port 8008. API 8 is security misconfiguration. This is a broad category of multiple possible use cases of misconfigurations in various levels. At the application side, like sending sensitive information in the URL or as a query parameter. At the server side, like exposing server information in the headers or returning error messages containing too much information. At the API gateway side, by not enforcing rate controls, or at the web application firewall side, applying monitor mode instead of block mode. These security misconfigurations assist attackers finding the weakest link they can exploit in order to gain unauthorized access to sensitive resources. In this example, the Akamai API security platform detected an internet-facing API that receives sensitive information, username and email through the query parameter. Browsers, proxies, and CDNs, or content delivery networks, tend to cache query parameters. It's a bad practice to include sensitive information such as tokens, usernames, or email addresses in the query string parameters. The recommended solution here is to pass the sensitive information in a header or in the body request instead. API 9 is improper inventory management. APIs keep evolving with new versions released periodically. The challenge is where old versions of the same API are forgotten, not being used anymore, but still accessible from the internet. Attackers can exploit these old API endpoints, assuming older versions have less security controls and monitoring. In this example, we see three versions of the same API. Version 1.2, 1.3, and 1.4 coexist and accessible from the internet. The Akamai API security platform detected that version 1.2 contains customer phone number, which is considered sensitive data type. The platform also detected that there is a newer version of this API endpoint and noted this in the alert details. We also see that the API risk score is higher for the older versions of the API, probably because they have less security controls and monitoring. The last OWASP API top 10 is unsafe consumption of APIs. This is a scenario where an API service is using another third-party API, which might be compromised by attackers. Insufficient input validation of the third-party API may cause command injection, SQL injection, or redirection to a malicious website. In this example, an attempt to exploit a remote command execution of log4j in the user agent header was detected by the Akamai API security platform. Attackers could exploit this log4j vulnerability by sending requests containing malicious code that could then be executed on the API server. With that, I'll pass it back to you, Menachem, to summarize the session.
Thank you very much, Eli, for really detailed and really informative information about the OWASP API Top 10. I learned a lot from, the stories that you shared, and some of them sounds really simple to execute. And I was thinking to myself, does some organizations not protecting against that? But when you show the stories and the examples, I was like, okay, that's really critical and important thing that everyone should be familiar with today. For our audience, if you want to learn more about how Akamai protects against the OWASP API Top 10, go to our website, and there is a great resource that goes into each of the OWASP API Top 10 into details to explain what each of them mean and how the Akamai API security solution can help you to solve and prevent those issues. But before we finish, I wanted to highlight something that's really important. The OWASP API Top 10 is a great starting point for protecting against threats, but getting complete protection about additional threats require not just the OWASP API Top 10, but more capabilities, more options, and more features that the Akamai API security solution can help you and drive you and walk you through the API security maturity level. Because you need to have full discovery, understand what is happening, but then you would like to organize your APIs, find threats, and perform prevention. So starting with OWASP API, it's a great start, but that's not the end. Start there, but look what comes next, how you can elevate and take your security to the next level. As a summary, the OWASP is really important, but API security combines multiple stages and approaches to protect your organization for the latest attacks against APIs. Start with the OWASP API and move to the next stages. With that, thank you very much for joining us today, and special thank you to Eli for his amazing work on that presentation. If you have any more questions, feel free to reach out to us, and we'll be happy to show you how the Akamai API security solution can detect and prevent against API threats, or OWASP API Top 10, and much more.
Thank you very much, and feel free to engage with us. We are happy to talk about API security.
Thank you very much.